Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to this PhenoLab session today. We are today with Natalie Depraz. She is a French philosopher. We welcome her and we appreciated her time. She's a specialist in German philosophy, phenomenology, and more specifically Edmund Husserl. She's a professor at the University of Rouen, Normandy, and an academic.
No, actually, now I'm at Nanterre University in Paris
Okay. I'm sorry.
for 2 years.
Okay. So, and but you are still an academic member of the Husserl archives, or?
Yes, of course.
Yes, yeah, okay. And she's the founder of Rouen School of Phenomenology. So, yeah. And our talk will be today about phenomenological empiricism, the philosophy of micro-phenomenology. So we welcome her for her talk.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation. And so I'm going to talk directly. I have no PowerPoint, so I hope you will be able to hear me and follow what I will speak slowly, so that everybody is able to understand. So the title of my talk is, as you said, Phenomenological Empiricism, the philosophy of micro-phenomenology. And first, as an introduction, I would like to show some internal limits of what we call the transcendental philosophy in order to frame the scope of my talk. Actually, this presentation is situated within the framework of what we refer usually as being the transcendental philosophy. And I will actually use the term phenomenological empiricism in order to make a step aside from transcendental philosophy. And I will try to identify this phenomenological empiricism as something that could be the philosophy of micro-phenomenology. So I will, of course, define these words, empiricism, phenomenology, and micro-phenomenology in the course of my talk. So this designation, phenomenological empiricism, might immediately appear suspicious to phenomenological philosophers for whom the transcendental paradigm remains largely unsurmountable. So in my opinion, this unsurmountability of transcendental philosophy shows itself in at least three different ways. This is first the case when the reference to Kantian or post-Kantian philosophy remains dominant, even when it is critically reinvested from a hermeneutic scheme broadening transcendental idealism into phenomenological transcendental idealism. So in that case, we have to do with the hermeneutic motif of transcending the transcendental from within the transcendental. And this is, in this case, this kind of motif that is mobilized. Second, this unsurmountability, so-called unsurmountability, is also visible when we have to do with many attempts to go beyond Husserl's transcendental phenomenology itself in the direction of its ontological, with Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty, with its ethical with Levinas, or metaphysical with Michel-Henry, Jean-Luc Marion. And this is, in that case, a dialectical motif of transcending the transcendental, but that's fairly classical within the history of phenomenology. And finally, thirdly, this is also the case. I mean, this unsurmountability, so-called unsurmountability, is also the case when we dig deeper into Husserlian phenomenology itself. And this has been, for example, identified since the 1990s. And it's again the case today with some internal shifts since the extension of the transcendental ego, for example, to intersubjectivity, history, generativity, passivity, or more recently, emotions or values. So these attempts, for example, can be seen in Anthony Steinberg's work in generativity, or for intersubjectivity, what I did myself with my PhD thesis on Husserl and intersubjectivity, or what Dan Zahavi at that very moment also did in his PhD thesis about intersubjectivity, or for passivity with people like Anne Montavon or Bruce Bégou in France. So this is a genealogical motif of transcending the transcendental from within its own potentialities in Husserl. So I myself navigated in this last perimeter of the transcendental's genealogical unsurmountability through its internal deepening and its different extensions. This is what led me, for example, to suggest in a book I wrote in the early 2001, Lucidity of the Body, the Transcendental Empiricism in Phenomenology. I suggested that with that expression, Transcendental Empiricism, it was a way to create this genealogical deepening inside the Husserlian phenomenology, with the aim of revealing its own potentialities. So in doing so, I was following the early footsteps of a Hungarian phenomenologist, Wilhelm Szilágyi, who wrote a book in the late 50s, which was a lecture actually in Freiburg, entitled Introduction to Phenomenology, very simply, also translated in French in 2011, and where he describes the third phase of Husserl's philosophy, so what we usually call the genetic and generative phenomenology. He names this phase, the third phase of the 20s and 30s, a transcendental positivism. So this idea, his idea, first of all, is to give some rigor and methodological account of the positive productivity of an internal tension between the empirical and the transcendental. So to create something positive, productive about this tension, rather than seeing this opposition as a failure, or in a style that is still very much Kantian, inherited from Kant's philosophy, as something that would be a problematic or an internal contradiction, which is also the way, for example, a philosopher like Paul Ricoeur understands it. So with this understanding of a relationship between the empirical and the transcendental as a contradiction, so as something negative, problematic, or even as a failure, some Husserl's interpreters have negatively interpreted the philosophy of the last generative decade of the life world, what is called the life world, as falling back into empiricism. Here I quote, for example, Françoise Dasture's book, Husserl from Mathematics to History, where she uses this expression of falling back into empiricism. So the idea is also, secondly, to take seriously the very notion of transcendental experience, which in Husserl himself clearly shifts the Kantian transcendental from something that was an a priori formal conditionality of the possibility of experience to a phenomenological transcendental dimension, which is therefore no longer merely formal, but becomes the very object of experimentation. For example, very exemplarily, in fact, when I carry out the epoche, so the very method of phenomenology, I actually do something. I suspend preconceptions. I carry out an experience that is a suspending experience that I will call transcendental. So the expression transcendental experience therefore refers to a genuine experimentation, namely an effectuation, what I will call an effectuation, a doing of the transcendental attitude, which is carried out by a subject who actually suspends his or her preconceptions. This second feature characterizes actually my idea of a practical experiential phenomenology, which is directly inspired by Husserl's philosophy, but pushes it into its limit zones of real effectuations. So the idea here is to set in motion, if I may say, the reductive and constitutive transcendental structure of the subject itself, which is then understood as an experiential operative dynamic and not as a mere a priori justification of knowledge. That's what I called in the early 2000s, in the beginning of the century, a practical turning of point in phenomenology, or what I also called phenomenology as praxis in different articles in these years, and that I also developed in a book that I co-wrote with two scientists, Francisco Varela and Pierre Vermersch, on becoming aware experiential pragmatics, which was published 2003 in English and 2011 in French, and also in another book, later book called Understanding Phenomenology as a Concrete Praxis in 2006. So this phenomenological option remains, in fact, situated within the framework of a transcendental philosophy. That's now my own observation. And it pushes this format to its limits, testing the productivity of its limits. So we are dealing here with internal limits, what we would call internal limits of the transcendental phenomenology. And this is the case with this motif of transcendental empiricism as being the productivity of the transcendental, when it is the result of the attitude of a subject performing an epoche. It is also the case, correlatively, with a practical experiential phenomenology that identifies the phenomenological method as the suspensive action performed by a subject. Today, this option seems to me to be increasingly what I would call a kind of desperate effort to overcome the transcendental from within by remaining part of it while seeking to escape it. So it seems to be a kind of unsolvable inside-outside paradox, which is well known to logicians, for example. For example, this problem, this unsolvable paradox, being in the frame but wanting to escape the frame, has been very nicely exemplified, for example, by the philosopher Gottfried Leibniz in the 17th century, who tells this anecdote about his own library, his own bookstore. With this question, where should I store the book that indexes the books in my bookshelves? If I store it in it, it becomes part of my books and can no longer play the role of the principle of their ordering. If I put it away outside my bookstore, it loses its status as a book. So that's a kind of a very concrete example to exemplify this insoluble paradox of transcendental, we want to escape, but still remaining in it. We can take another example, this time of a more psychological nature, which brings about more violently the tension inherent in the subject's position in a context from which she seeks to escape while remaining within that context. So, for example, I am in a marital relationship that generates unease without me first knowing how to identify it, for example, as toxic. And even identified as such, the logic of what we could call the perversion of this toxicity has the characteristic of generating an attachment that prevents any possible escape mechanism in the form of a flight. So we will therefore seek, without ever succeeding, to get out of this problematic relationship. The internal necessity of toxicity formed then the emblem, we could say, of a psychic enclosure. So these two examples, logical and psychological, represent the tension, so are indications of the structural tension, the saturation, or even the kind of stupefaction, which is generated by what I would call the problematic power of transcendental enclosure. To truly escape it, and therefore to free oneself from this saturation of thought that it engenders and the control that it exerts, one must explicitly accept to no longer remain within this framework and therefore explicitly take a step aside. So that leads me to a second step, which I called the external limit. So no longer the internal limit of transcendental phenomenological philosophy, but the external limit of this transcendental phenomenological, this time empiricism. So that's the second step. This is the virtue of the way of highlighting this external limit of the transcendental. And that's what I now want to assume as phenomenological empiricism. Such a way out of the transcendental offers to my mind a very fruitful possibility of liberation from a dominant and centuries-old philosophy characterized by its logical mechanism of internal control and its ontology of power. This philosophy that I call in the second part of my recent book, 2024 book on the experience of surprise, entitled Surprise, a Crisis in Thought, in French, Surprise, Crise dans la pensée. That's what I call a philosophy with no surprise, in contrast to a philosophy of letting go, where surprise is the central operator of a self-withdrawal, renewal, and recreation of meaning. So to assume such a phenomenological empiricism, I drew on a major resource in the thought of the philosopher Gilles Deleuze. From the 1960s onwards, he forged what he calls, on the basis of a device openly critical of both Kant and Husserl, he uses this expression of a higher empiricism. In doing so, in a thematic way, he clearly restores the rights of nature as opposed to the mind that he understands as being the place of control and of power. This is what I also developed in the last chapter of my book, of the surprise book, through the expression of the surprise of nature, as revealing the most accomplished stopping point of the empirical, its extreme emblem, which ultimately puts thought and mind in crisis. So we have here to do with nature in the sense of its own potentiality, fruitfulness, which makes humans powerless or poor. In fact, what Helmut Plessner, Friedrich Engels, or Gottfried von Herder called the Mangelwesen, human being as being a Mangelwesen, so a human being that is characterized by its fragility. And we have concrete evidence today of it with the climate crisis, but also more fundamentally, at least, as being intrinsically related, our difficulty as humans to connect with ourselves, to accept our lived body in its hyper aesthetic dimension, and also our invertebrate ability to disconnect from ourselves and to act as if our body did not exist, as if only our mind characterized us as humans. So that's very dominantly what's at work in neurosciences today, still today. Methodologically, Gilles Deleuze offers us a remarkable critical entry into the situation of the transcendental approach with a view of identifying its external limit and opening up its possible liberation. In this liberation move, the Deleuzian notion of décalque, which can be translated with decal or reflection, plays a crucial role. Deleuze sees in the Kantian transcendental a mere décalque of the empirical. I will keep this word in French, décalque, because, well, it's difficult to find a right English translation. What does it mean? The term décalque is extremely instructive. For Deleuze, it indicates a mechanism of imposition of the thought over the body, but it accentuates the weakness of this imposition, which therefore no longer has a dominating function. So it is not trivial that Deleuze uses the term décalque, which refers to a motor activity first of tracing on a support. My daughter traces, she reproduces the design of her hands. For example, she's trying to capture by tracing the outlines on a transparent paper, which is precisely what we concretely call a décalque. Maybe we could translate then here as tracing paper. You can note the interest, the interesting thing with this manual or digital activity, with this concrete image of the tracing, which is not a concept, but an organic indication, an example of a situation and an activity that invites us to think with and through the body, with and through our hands. So the critical philosophical meaning that Deleuze gives to the notion of décalque is directly linked to the semantics of the activity of reproduction. To décalque is to produce a form that simply reproduces what is already given. We can hear the resonance with the Platonic model of the copy in relation to the original. In other words, the tracing has no particular content. It produces nothing new or different from what it reproduces, except if you would consider that the stylization of the given is a production in itself. In any case, in the critical sense that Deleuze gives it, the décalque is a mere weak and even weakened reflection of a given reality. In short, it has no force of its own. According to Deleuze, the transcendental is the emblem of such a décalque, which reproduces without possessing a productive force. It is a reflection without novelty. It is an artifactual representation without any dynamic, creative dynamic, or dynamic of surprise. Each in their own way, following specific hermeneutics, more historical or more aesthetic. We have two contemporary authors, Marc Relly, in his Gilles Deleuze Philosophie des transzendentalen Empirismus in 2003, and a French philosopher who happens to be my colleague at the University of Nanterre, in Paris-Nanterre, Anne Sauvagnargues, in her book Deleuze l'empirisme transcendental in 2009. Both have brought out Deleuze's critical gesture in relation to Kant's and Husserl's transcendental philosophy, and correlatively the gesture of a higher empiricism that rejects a reproductive tracing and brings to the fore the heuristic dynamics of creation, whether artistic, scientific, or philosophical. So in that regard, I quote Gilles Deleuze in his very famous book, Difference and Repetition, in 1968. I quote, "Transcendental empiricism is the only way not to trace the transcendental onto the figures of the empirical. So here trace onto is translated from décalque. In the chapter entitled The Thought Image, l'image de pensée, he claims a higher empiricism to which, according to him, only the transcendental has to be subjected. He writes, again, I quote, "The discredit into which the doctrine of faculties, so the Kantian critical philosophy, has fallen today, although it is a completely necessary part of the system of philosophy, can be explained by a misunderstanding of this properly transcendental empiricism, which was vainly replaced by a decalque of the transcendental on the empirical." End of quote. To summarize, Deleuze's main argument here is that the transcendental has no creative force, no productive power, and that only transcendental empiricism can give him life again and give it back a creative and heuristic dynamic. So for my part, I keep this heuristic, productive, creative dimension specific to empiricism, but I no longer even see the need to weight down empiricism with a transcendental framework, as I had been trying to do some time ago in my rereading of Husserl, confronted with Deleuze, for example, in a 2011 article entitled L'empirisme transcendental from Deleuze to Husserl, as if empiricism still needed this conceptual crutch, this béquille in French, of the transcendental to be assured of its philosophical legitimacy. In fact, if we look more closely now in what Deleuze calls a higher empiricism, which he assumes to be his transcendental empiricism, we can say that he continues against all odds to see in the transcendental a safeguard of the empirical. If empiricism ensures the rescue of the transcendental in Deleuze by virtue of its creative and heuristic capacity, the transcendental remains its safeguard. Could it be that the empirical, if unbound from the transcendental, would be carried away in a kind of unbridled enthusiasm that would be philosophically unacceptable? But, well, this hypothesis is made in the name of a certain conception of philosophy that is not directly addressed here. So what in the name of what conception of philosophy would we say that? So today I would like to take a step further beyond the Deleuzian position itself. And so to do so, I must step outside what I call the transcendental enclosure, in which deep down actually Deleuze remains caught, so unbeknownst, à son insu, whereas he has at the same time this gesture of injecting creative force into the maintained transcendental form. So I would say that he remains caught in what I called this kind of enclosure of fascination, or which is exemplified with the logical and psychological examples above. So we can also note that Jacques Derrida himself, in his very early book written 2054, which was a master thesis published in 1991 and entitled The Problem of Genesis in Edmund Husserl, Derrida himself seeks to identify Husserlian motives of force and affective materiality that would impact the transcendental form to the point of causing it to implode. However, this implosion will lead Derrida to produce his famous thought about deconstruction, and thus to move away from phenomenology, which in his view remains phenomenology definitively linked to the coordinates of the transcendental itself, even modified. Actually, this was also already my diagnosis in an article 2000 entitled De l'empirisme transcendantal entre Husserl et Derrida, which I published in the Journal for Phenomenology Alter. But my hypothesis, however, is that, contrary to Derrida, the implosion of the transcendental under the shock of the empirical, or in the way I would formulate it now with my work about surprise, the throwing into crisis of the philosophical under the blow of surprise, it does not lead to an exit from phenomenology. So I would not go in the direction of Derrida's going out phenomenology, nor a fortiori to an exit from philosophy. To my view, it engages another phenomenology, which needs to be unlocked from its transcendental coordinates. And it also means to re-engage another philosophical posture, which has to be detached from an ontology of power and from a logic of control. This amounts to assuming a specific phenomenological empiricism, as I named it, which restores its right to properties, to two main properties, which are the effectiveness, first, and the singularity, second, of experience. So as a consequence, this implies to take a step back from Husserl's phenomenology itself. Indeed, the Husserlian concept of experience is characterized by two main properties. First, experience is situated on the level of possibility, in connection in particular with the process of the imaginary eidetic variation, as we know. Second, it responds to a structure of universality. To these two Husserlian properties of experience, I will substitute its effectiveness against possibility and its singularity against universality. This amounts to situating the phenomenological expectation of this empiricism, detached from its transcendental form, on the level of a microscopic phenomenology, to use the expression of the French epistemologist Gaston Bachelard in his Poetics of Space, which also involves a new kind of ontology and epistemology. So I come now to my third and final step, which I called Phenomenological Empiricism as the philosophy of micro-phenomenology. So if we detach ourselves from the transcendental, in the sense that we will interrupt its satellisation or its dependence from it, it amounts to liberate the creative force of empiricism. The interesting thing about phenomenological empiricism is that it contains within itself the virtue of a renewal, which is linked to new experiences and new categories. This gives philosophy a future, a prospect of inventiveness, and it shifts it away from the mere observation of the past, of its history, inviting it to revisit this history through new prisms. This is why, to my view, surprise and its own dynamics is also a particular interesting operator in the context of phenomenological empiricism. So as a general mapping, I will indicate now three major lines of force of this phenomenological empiricism, all three of which shift from the Husserlian project. So first, the singularizing scope of lived experience, where the general structure of experience, which is the Husserl understanding of experience, is no longer sufficient for its objectivity. Second, the requirement for an effectuation of the experience, where its situation in terms of its possibility no longer exhausts its reality. And third, the transformative scope of the description, which no longer can be limited to merely a restitution of the features of the properties of the experience. With these three lines of force, singularity of the lived experience versus general structure, effectuation of the experience versus its possibility, transformative scope of the description versus its restitutive account, we have the general philosophical contention of what phenomenological empiricism is. So in this third and final step, I would like to show how the general philosophical dynamic proper to phenomenological empiricism unfolds in action in the mode of a refined heuristic description of a singular experience, which has the important virtue of concretely embodying this general dynamic. Otherwise, we would continue to indulge in words, as we say in French, se payer de mots, and to use concepts that lack embodiment. Such a refined heuristic description of a singular experience is the way in which we can preliminarily define what is called micro-phenomenology. So at this stage, I have in mind 3 ontological properties and 3 epistemological properties as a preliminary configuration of this philosophy of micro-phenomenology. The ontological properties concern the being or the quality of the experience, of the subject, and of the relationship. So experience, lived experience, subject, relationship, characterized in their being, so ontological properties. And while the 3 epistemological properties concern their mode of access, the way we access to the subject, to the experience, to the relationship. And these properties correspond to each other in pairs. So the first ontological property, the singularity of experience, contains 2 main sub-features, namely what I will call the hic et nunc of the experience, the fact that the experience is given in a specific time and specific space. And second, as a sub-feature, its intimacy. And it is directly linked to a first epistemological property, which specifies the way in which it is accessed, its specific mode of access. So being and mode of access respond to each other. The first epistemological property corresponds to the particular mode of access to this singular experience, what Pierre Vermersch, the founder of micro-phenomenology, also called explicitation interview, names with the term evocation, and which I will make synonymous with an epoche of general representation in favor of the singular situation of the moment experienced, that is experienced. So I will come back to this experiential process with an example that will be an opportunity for an experiential immersion. And today I will basically focus on this primary epistemological property. Before that, let me just indicate the general framework, so all the properties at stake. The second ontological property concerns the subject it's herself, and it targets its hyperesthesia or heightened sensitivity. The second ontological property has also its own mode of access, namely a descriptive transformative language adapted to it, namely what Vermersch calls the verbalization of the experience, or the putting into words, or the embodied speaking, which makes it possible to collect finely, granularly, as he says, fine segments and microphases of the experience. Finally, the third ontological property concerns the relationship, what we call in phenomenology generally intersubjectivity, but relationship is broader than intersubjectivity. So a relational dimension inherent to the micro-phenomenological approach in its interview format, and which I think of as an inter-enaction. So this responds to an epistemological property that gives access to this inter-enactive relationship in the form of an experiential analysis of the descriptions produced in this inter-enactive framework through an experiential and dynamic eidetic variation. But I won't detail this today. So in the in the remaining part of this presentation, I would like now to focus on the 2 prime properties that respond to each other, ontological and epistemological, namely the singularity of lived experience and its success by evocation, that is, by an epoche of general representations. To do this, I will proceed in two stages and in two ways. First, I will approach the singularity of a lived experience through Husserlian phenomenology itself, by restaging the first ontological sub-property of singularity, namely the ich et nunc dimension, while taking an example from the paragraph 27 in Ideas 1, the first idea book, Husserl book, in 1913. And second, I will approach the prime mode of access to singularity, evocation, as epoche of representations, through an example that I will propose to you as a way of creating and initiating immersion into micro-phenomenology. So first, the singularity of a lived experience from Husserl onward. Let us start by quoting a passage from this paragraph 27. I quote, I can shift, no, Husserl is writing, I can shift my attention, detach it from this desk that I have just observed carefully, and take it into the part of the room that I could not see, behind my back, towards the veranda, into the garden, towards the children under the tree. Unquote. In this description proposed by Husserl, the statement we just read is in the present tense. I can shift my attention, etc. And in the indicative mode. It contains a deictic, demonstrative adjective this, in Latin aec, in the expression this desk, and the grammatical subject is the first person personal pronoun I, which is itself situated in a concrete and familiar, very daily living space, the veranda, the tree, the garden. All these markers truly indicate an embodied speech act, we could say. However, even this Husserl's example, which you can identify as situated, remains generic. And that's my point here. And the description remains structural. And why is this so? The indicator of the level of structural generality of the description is a link to the mode of the possibility, which opens this description. I can then shift my attention. I can. In fact, Husserl may have lived such an experience dozens of times. It does mean that when he wrote these sentences, it doesn't mean that when he wrote these sentences, he does not have in mind a given situation and the spatial temporal occurrence of his given experience, of course. Probably even at the moment of writing, he did visualize the situation. He did have what he names an intuitive donation, anschauliche Gegebenheit of his desk, of the children, of the very act of attentional shift. Nonetheless, this lived situation is strangely not referred to a single unique moment. Uniqueness being one of the most important sub-properties of this ich et nunc property of the singularity of experience. The situation that Husserl mentions is in fact much more likely to be a blurred one and to be implicitly borrowed from numerous previous lived occurrences, sedimented occurrences. All the more so as it is undoubtedly the case here. Husserl, in fact, often has such an experience when he is writing at his desk. In short, through these sentences, he gives us an account of a structural shift in his attention from his seated position at his desk to the veranda, the garden, and the children. In fact, this act of attentional shift is not methodically situated. That is to say, it is not established as situated in a single occurrence, nor, moreover, here it is not methodically extracted by variations of its multiple situated occurrences. in order to build a possible unified structure of his experience. Of course, it is possible for us in turn to perform again this attentional shift in a kind of imaginatory variation, according to a mode of transposition that is characteristic of the mode of possibility in Husserl, and which draws on mathematics in the familiar mode of hypothesis and conditional proposition. Let's assume that if referred to, etc. However, it does not amount to a uniquely situated experience of attentional shift in the precise sense of a singular experience. As a result, the description remains generic, and therefore it can be said that it is broadly outlined, only broadly outlined. So you may be surprised. Isn't it usually considered that phenomenology is par excellence a philosophy of lived experience, frequently referred to as in the first person? Isn't it true that it is an I that describes, a subject that lives, an ego that produces acts of epoche and constitution, where the sciences are characterized in a standard way by their third-person methodology, namely assuming a position unbeknownst à l'insu du sujet, without the subject's knowledge, analyzed, for example, from brain traces or bodily behavior. And this is true. However, while assuming the heritage of phenomenology, this recent phenomenological approach, named micro-phenomenology, offers us a more radically and more consistently first-person method. For me, it is really the only approach that really deserves to be called a first-person approach without any misrepresentation. So why is it so? Rather than introducing you to microphenomenology in a general way, which would basically be rather inconsequential, inconsistent, I will now invite you to enter into it in medias res by means of an example that will be a singular experience in the first person. This will be an opportunity to identify in action the respondent between the two prime properties, ontological and epistemological, of phenomenological empiricism as being the philosophy of microphenomenology, namely the evocation or epoche of general representations for the epistemological property, as the mode of access to the singularity of lived experience as the ontological property. So to do so, I suggest you to go back to the moment you woke up this morning, to the precise moment this morning when you realized you were awake. Indeed, the first condition for obtaining a detailed description of the experience of this moment is to return to that precise moment, namely to the hic et nunc of its occurrence. So I suggest that you first describe in your mind or in a sheet of paper your surroundings, what Pierre Vermersch calls the context. Namely, specifically here, you can answer for yourself the following questions. How are you lying down? On the back, on the belly, on the side? Are you lying under your sheets or above them? What is the room like? Is it spacious, narrow, high, low? How is the light? Is it still dark? Is it clear already? Is it sunny? How is the temperature in your room? Is it pleasant, cool, dry? So I then suggest you to go back to the precise moment of your waking up, with again answering some following questions. So first, for example, does the alarm wake you up? Or have you been awakened before it rings? Or did you wake up this morning without having set an alarm? When waking up, how do you feel? Are you ready? Are you fit? Are you still tired? How is your emotional state? Are you depressed, sad, or serene, joyful, or how else? How is your cognitive state? Is it clear, focused? Is it scattered, confused, or how else? What about your orientation, your inner moves in space, your thoughts? How are they? Are they confused? Are you clear? Are they multiple, focused? Or again, how else? Are you quick or not in your movement of recognition of the space where you are, whether you're at home or in another place that is not your usual place? So if you have done what I ask you to suggest you to do during these moments, during these questions, so if you have put yourself again in this moment and try to describe it for yourself through the different questions I asked, open questions, what you have just done corresponds through these open questions directed at the moment you woke up this morning. It corresponds to the very beginning of a micro-phenomenological interview. In fact, through these questions, I have guided you through the first aspects and segments of your experience of waking up at that moment this morning. This is what Pierre Vermersch calls the context of your experience. So thanks to the method of this interview, the subject that we are is likely to access more finely her singular experience of this moment. More specifically, the guidance that I just suggested provides you with a support to accessing the singularity of your experience. This concrete embodied access corresponds to what Vermersch calls the process of evocation, or the movement into entering into evocation. You return to that moment, you visualize it internally, you formulate it within yourself or verbally, and by concretely detailing that moment, that situation, you reclaim it, you embody it again in the finest possible way. This posture of evocation is difficult to maintain. It is fragile and ephemeral, and having a guidance facilitates access to that moment in its singularity. Indeed, our experience in its uniqueness, which is unlike any other, is very often spontaneously covered over by a generic representation, because we often avoid ourselves and we fabricate the representation of what we are experiencing rather than confronting its singularity, which takes us out of our comfort zone, as we say today. Typically, if I ask you how you wake up this morning, and you answer me, I usually wake up at 8 a.m. and I set my alarm. You are, in fact, reporting not your experience of this morning, but the generic structure of your experience of waking up, or even more, the representation you have of your waking up. These adverbial phrases, in general, usually betray this structural and generic level of the representation of your awakening. This is what Pierre Vermersch rightly defines as the description of a class of experiences. Therefore, the formulation of your experience this morning will not be that of your unique singular experience, hic et nunc, of waking up this morning. It will correspond to the generic description of your waking up experience. And it is this type of description that we often read under the pen of phenomenological philosophers when they choose to refer to a situation that they will nevertheless say they have experienced. This is typically what Husserl does in the paragraph 27 of Ideas, which we have read and analyzed. This is why I choose to rename evocation and entry into evocation with the expression of epoche of general representations in order to favor the targeting of a singular experience. By contrast, the term epoche, if we rethink it in a concrete way, in a practical way, makes it possible to clean up all the superimpositions of meanings, the superimpositions that we very quickly graft themselves into the singular moment, to sediment it, unbeknownst, without my knowledge, into other singular moments. In this respect, the method of the explicitation interview or micro-phenomenology offers, to my view, an innovative interpretative angle for the methodical operations and presupposition of Husserlian phenomenology itself. As being a discipline of fine descriptions of bodily processes, sensations, kinesthesia, proprioceptions, heartbeats, and of internal micro-processes, cognitive, attentional, emotional, or imaginative, of a specific singular moment experienced by a given subject at a given moment and in a specific place. It makes it possible to detect what remains generic, namely desingularized in the Husserlian conception of lived experience, and it thus offers a descriptive, ontological, and epistemological advance for phenomenology itself. So compared to Husserl, the experiential and descriptive cursor is thus displaced in two ways within microphenomenology. First, to sum up, the lived experience is singular, not generic or structural. Second, the level of granularity of the description is reinforced, which gives rise to the uncovering of fine micro-sequences of detailed processes of emergence of the experienced and of the highlighting of quasi-synchronic moments. So, microphenomenology is therefore both related and yet far distinct from Husserlian phenomenology. So, to conclude, the philosophy of microphenomenology is therefore not a return to phenomenological philosophy. Of course, phenomenology, especially Husserlian phenomenology, is also much more than a historical point of support for microphenomenology. In his 2012 book, Explicitation et Phénoménologie, Explicitation and Phenomenology, Pierre Vermersch shows the structuring role of Husserlian phenomenology for microphenomenological explicitation. That is, for example, exemplarily, the theory of modes of consciousness, the theory of time as a living retentional present, the theory of passivity and passive genesis, as well as the theory of attention and attentional dynamics, are unique resources for describing a priori structures of experience. However, the philosophy of microphenomenology goes beyond historical phenomenology because it retains in its specific methodology the experiential and embodied fabric of singular lived experience in the first person. And this is why I suggested to call it an phenomenological empiricism. So today I have sought to do justice to the first property of this philosophy of microphenomenology on the side of its ontology and epistemology by outlining certain aspects of its conception of lived experience as singularity, and here in particular of its property of its hic et nunc dimension, and more specifically of this property of uniqueness by identifying the epistemological respondent in the access by evocation to the singularity of this lived experience. So, of course, it would be necessary to frame and to detail further the other properties of ontological properties, the hyperesthesia of the subject and the intersubjective relation as inter-enaction, as well as its epistemological properties of access by granular description and by an experiential eidetic analysis. Phenomenological empiricism, as being the philosophy of microphenomenology, is a way to depart clearly from any speculative approaches of a metaphysical kind, whether analytical, for example, speculative realism, or phenomenological, for example, the metaphysics of life in the style of Renaud Barbaras, which forms, to my view, a micro-phenomenology without effective anchoring in a singularized experience. One could consider that what Jocelyn Benoit calls realism, understood as a non-speculative contextual realism, has more in common with phenomenological empiricism because of its of this anti-speculative position and its emphasis on the contextuality of experience. However, realism remains, in my opinion, a philosophical position that takes us to the side of things. Realism from res, Latin res, however sensitive they may be, and therefore it loses sight of the fact that only a subject situated hic et nunc and connected to herself in her own intimacy is able to be the bearer of an embodied anchoring, which is necessary to diffuse the speculative thinking above ground. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope it was okay for the listening, and well, maybe have some questions. If it was maybe a bit long, but I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for your talk. That was very interesting. So let's see if there is anybody who has a question. Now I stop recording.